very excited to have our next guest on the show with Stephen and I. She is in Olympia, Washington, and she's worn many hats, I think, throughout her career. But currently, she's the director of conservation with Wolf Haven International. She is part of the Wolf Advisory Group with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and she got her PhD and master's from UC Davis and her bachelor's at Evergreen State College in Washington State. We welcome Amy Porter. Amy, it's so nice to finally meet you. Really excited to get into all the wonderful details that we were talking about. How you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and is it pronounced Jeff or Geoff?
Jeff.
I can't remember who. Jeff. Okay, so thank Jeff for connecting the dots. He circled back from the symposium, oh my goodness, 3 years ago now already.
Right.
And brought your name. So thanks to Jeff for doing that. Just give everybody a basic layout of you. Where did you grow up? How did your interests start, especially with animals? And you were talking about wildlife behavior when we're going back and forth in emails, and then you moved into anthropology and ecology. How did this journey start for you?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Western Washington, pretty close to the temperate rainforest here in the state. And, I did not grow up in a particularly outdoorsy family. We spent time having picnics along rivers, going to the beach, but I wasn't going out on these epic adventures and hiking. But there has always been a deep love for animals, and that is widespread throughout my family. And, whenever people ask me how my path got started, I always laugh a little bit because I'm reminded of something from my childhood that my family still lovingly teases me about till this day. And, when you're a kid, like kindergarten age, and your teachers ask you, like, what's your name and where do you live? Well, I would always say I lived in a tree. And it didn't matter how many times they asked me or how many different ways they asked me, I was insistent that I lived in a tree. And so they always tease me, and they're like, I think that was probably a sign of maybe your path to come. So yeah, my particular connection with animals, I really love animal behavior. And that's part of what drew me to the Evergreen State College for my bachelor's work, because at the time, that school was very oriented around field natural history courses and taking students out into the field and just observing animals, documenting their behavior. And I had always kind of had a real fascination with the Amazon. And some of that could have been, having grown up around temperate rainforests, but really drawn to that dense, forest. And I was part of a tropical ecology class and had a really incredible opportunity to do a field project in a remote area of the Peruvian Amazon in Manu National Park. And part of this program was for students to get experience designing, little independent field projects and then going out and actually trying to do them. And so while we were all, thinking about projects, we got together and watched a documentary on Manu just to get a feel for what are some of the critters that we can see out there, what could be possible. And in that film was some footage of giant river otters. And these are 6-foot long otters. They live in extended family packs. They hunt in, there's cooperative hunting in packs. And their Spanish name is lobos del rio, which translates to river wolves. So you might notice, there's some circularity here, like my path has kind of come full circle with now working with wolves, but I was so fascinated by them. And as we learned more about this research station that we were going to, the research station is situated on Oxbow Lake. And there was a resident family of giant otters that had a den there and lived on that lake. So I was like, yeah, totally, I could do a project on them. And so I had a research partner that was going to help me do it. And we get down there, and I think it was the second day that we were out trying to follow them, he's like, this is way too hard. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to do a different project. And I was like, holy crap, what am I going to do? Like, I don't have any field experience. This was my first big experience in the field. No idea what I was doing. But here I am in the middle of the Amazon, hanging out on kayaks, paddling around, watching these otters. And I was like, of course I'm going to stick with it, So I was like, I'll just see what I see and, it'll be that. And everybody else there was working with plants. And so, they would get up at like 8 o'clock, they'd go out, they'd collect all this data. And I'm like, I saw a butt for, like a minute. But it was fascinating and I loved it. And so at this research site, there were, other researchers there, mostly working on their PhD projects. And there was a guy who was studying these little monkeys called titi monkeys. And these animals are also very hard to follow because they're tiny, they're cryptic, they live, they spend a lot of time high up in the canopy in these tangles. And then in the rainy season, they really like swampy areas. So you're like wading through swamp water up to your chest to try to follow them. And he, so they're hard animals, but he saw my, persistence or my stubbornness with these otters. And so he was like, hey, I really need field assistance. Do you want to come back and work with me? I was like, heck yeah. So I went back to Evergreen. I finished my bachelor's, and then I was off to Peru again to work with him and these monkeys. And I spent a year there. And the plan was to, spend a year there, get some more field experience, and then go to grad school. And from that experience, though, I just kept getting offered all these really cool seasonal jobs like, hey, do you want to go to Hawaii and study birds? Or do you want to go to Madagascar and study lemurs? And so that year ended up being 8 years of traveling around to all these different places throughout the world and mostly studying birds and primates, but really finding that I loved animal behavior. I loved studying. I loved social behavior. And primates were a really perfect fit for that because, typically they're very social mammals. And so at the end of all of that, like around that 8 year time frame, I was thinking like, gosh, I'm really not earning any money doing this. And I also, although I had excellent field skills, I didn't necessarily have the theoretical background to really understand like some of the things I was seeing, the evolution of behavior. And the main thing is that I didn't have the credentials to apply for funding if I wanted to continue this path. I couldn't apply for grants because I wasn't affiliated with any university. And also, I was working on everybody else's projects. These weren't my projects. And so I thought, gosh, if I'm going to continue this path, and if I really want to do, develop my own project, I'm going to have to go back. I'm going to have to go to grad school now. So I applied and I didn't get in. I was like, your GRE scores suck. And, Evergreen, I didn't have a GPA. So I was a hard applicant to assess because you couldn't evaluate me based on numbers. I didn't have a GPA and I had really lousy GRE scores. So I went back to the field. I actually went back to Peru and studied titi monkeys again for another year. And I decided, okay, I'm going to try one more time and we'll see what happens. In the second round, I got into grad school. And so that brought me to UC Davis, and where I did a comparative study with actually those same monkeys, titi monkeys, but another similar species called saki monkeys. And then after I was finishing my PhD work, or in the midst of finishing my PhD work, I had this incredible opportunity to go study Grauer's gorillas in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Grauer's gorillas are really fascinating because there are subspecies of eastern gorilla. There's two subspecies. You have mountain gorillas, which are what most people are familiar with, and then Grauer's gorillas. And Grauer's gorillas only occur in the eastern portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's not much known about them because they're really hard to study. I mean, they're in a place, the DRC is not the easiest place to work. There's a lot of political instability, there's insecurity there, and they are in an area that's not entirely safe to work. But who turns down an opportunity to go study gorillas, right? So I ended up spending 4 years, just a little over 4 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo, working with both gorillas and bonobos. And it was really that experience that introduced me to the human dimensions of wildlife conflict. And prior to that, I'd spent all my time working in really remote places, away from people, by choice, and really focused on animal behavior. And I didn't have any interest in working with humans, and that's interesting because I was in the Department of Anthropology, but my link there was more because of the primate behavior than it was an interest in the human aspects of it. So anyway, my time in Congo, it changed my life. It changed my life in so many ways, but what it really did is it changed my perspective and my approach to conservation work and how we go about it. And so after that 4 years, I came back to the States. I brought a feral Congolese dog home with me. We got back
Jeez.
just about a month and a half before COVID lockdown. And so a lot, like so many people, a lot changed for me. Now I have this feral dog that I have to get acclimated. And I thought, man, getting this dog out of Congo is going to be the hardest part. And if I can get out of here, everything else is going to be super easy. And boy, was I wrong. Like, it's been a real challenge getting her socialized, and she has a lot of anxiety. She has what they call clinical separation anxiety. So she has a very hard time being away from me. So that changed a lot for me because I had to think, gosh, I'm not going back to Congo. I've got this, super lovely but challenging dog that I'm now a guardian of. And I knew I couldn't do the same kind of work I was doing. I couldn't do field work because she couldn't go with me. And so I had to start thinking, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to like figure out a new job with this dog? And what is that going to look like? And in the middle of COVID, And so I started feeling like, gosh, I learned so much from the Congo. I would really like to apply some of that, those experiences towards conservation work locally in Washington. And thinking about that, it was like, gosh, that led me straight to wolves.
Man, what a 12-year journey, man.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Wild.
You kind of already answered the question I was going to ask, but maybe there are more specifics to it. The question was, I mean, animal behavior seems like it could mean so many different things. And I was going to ask if there's a subtopic under the category of animal behavior that really interests you, or is it sort of a broad focus on any and all animal behavior? And you kind of said social behavior, and I guess that could be pretty broad as well. So what do you consider the thing that really gets you going, the more specific, like within those broader contexts of behavior and social behavior?
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by all behavior. I think animals are amazing. And the more we spend time with them, the more we learn and the more we realize we don't know anything about them. With my PhD work with these monkeys and why I kept coming back to them. So they are socially monogamous, which means, they have pair mates. And a lot of people think of that as they mate for life. And that's not entirely the story. They may stay bonded or mated with a single partner for many years, but there's a lot more going on there. There's a lot more flexibility there. And with these two monkeys that I studied, and social monogamy is rare in primates. Only a handful of primates follow that mating or social system. And in these species with TD monkeys, it's actually the males that carry the infant from the time they're born all the way until they're locomoting independently. And so there's a lot of investment from the male in taking care of the babies. And then in the other species that I was comparing, Saki monkeys, they have the same social system. They're in a pair dynamic with their offspring, but there's no paternal care. The males don't do anything. I mean, not that they don't do anything, but they're not, investing that level of care. And I was like, wow, that's really bizarre. Like, why such difference in strategies? And when you've got a system where the males aren't investing a lot in paternal care, is there more flexibility in, their mating strategies? Are there more opportunities, or do we see them kind of cycle through different mates more often, or just like, what is that dynamic like? And so that, thinking about like kind of the evolution of social monogamy and pair mate dynamics and how much flexibility is in that, how, do animals really stay together for life? And what are the conditions that lead to them not staying with their pair mate? And then with the Growers gorillas, with them, because it's so challenging to just get there to be able to see them, there's not much known about them. So a lot of that work was just getting data on basic natural history. And then it was also kind of a comparative study with mountain gorillas. So the Growers gorillas live at slightly lower elevations, and there is a lot more fruit that's available to them during certain times of the year. And so we were looking at things like, does that change their social dynamics? Because when there's fruit going in different trees, they're moving more. And does that put them in interactions with other groups more? And what does that mean for, fluidness of group dynamics? And so those were some of the pieces that really captured me. But yeah, I think I find behavior so fascinating.
So what was the sort of flagship human wildlife conflict that was taking place in the Congo?
Yeah, so a lot of where these gorillas occur are in pretty densely, populated areas, but some are in areas where there's a lot of artisanal mining. And so there's rebel groups in the area. And so it's not like gorillas are getting into conflict in the way that we think about with wolves. They're not like crop raiding or, doing stuff like that. But there's a lot of poaching that happens just by nature of their proximity of where they are occurring. And then with great apes, great apes are really susceptible to human respiratory viruses. So, a simple cold for us can pass through them and wipe out an entire population of them, and very, very quickly. And so in some of these areas where they were occurring around, remote areas, but around human settlements, people going in to extract natural resources, just that proximity of folks who may be sick can really influence health of great ape populations. So in DRC, there was, just natural resource extraction going on that put people in closer proximity to primates, but a lot of poaching.
So when you're looking at these elements of human conflict that you just said is different than what we see here in the States as human wildlife conflict, what were some of the ways that were tried to mitigate that conflict, to lessen it, or to have some form of impact in a way to have the apes still be able to do their thing and the monkeys still be able to do their thing while people are trying to extract natural resources? And obviously there's the whole idea of going in and disrupting an ecological system like that. Mm-hmm. But what were some of the things that you took away from that, or some of the things you were able to implement before you left?
Well, so there's so many parallels too. I mean, it's a different context, but there's so many parallels with what I'm seeing with wolves too. And I think one of the first things that I recognized through my work there is that when you have issues, I mean, so much in Congo required working very closely with communities. And there's a lot of challenges to get communities to want to work with you. And I'll focus a little bit more maybe on my work in Western Congo, where I was working with bonobos and was doing a lot more community engagement projects. But in that scenario, the bonobos occurred in community managed forest. And so we were working with 13 communities, and each of those communities is kind of overseen by a village chief. And each of those communities manages their forest however their particular community decides. And so one community may, manage it for certain resources, and that could be very different from the neighboring community. So we had a challenge of working with single communities, but then also working with disputes between neighboring communities and trying to get them to collaborate with one another. And so with the bonobos in this forest, there was a lot of natural resource extraction happening. And one of the programs we tried to do was, what if we could work with communities to allocate portions of their forest, not their whole forest, but portions of it, and leave that entirely alone and really leave it for bonobo conservation specifically. So that meant no natural resource extraction in the bonobo protected areas and very limited human movement through that forest to try and prevent the spread of any respiratory illnesses. And in the beginning, not too many people were interested in doing that. But then we connected with the village chiefs and had a lot of conversations. And by the time I got there, there were 3 communities of the 13 that wanted to participate in this. And in exchange for allocating portions of their forest to bonobo conservation, then we would work to build alternative subsistence strategies. And so these could be things like organic gardens or other forms of meat that could kind of relieve some of the pressure on bush meat. There were a lot of interest in chickens. There were a lot of interest in guinea pigs and, trying to set up these things, but really trying to learn what is it that the community wants most, like not us saying, hey, it'd be really cool if you had a garden going, but what is it that community needs? And most of what they really wanted was access to healthcare, like a clinic and access to medicine, or they wanted schools built for their kids, like have the infrastructure, or they wanted like communal latrines, to actually have a sanitary place to regularly go to the bathroom. But the clinic and the schools were big things, but it was really that clinic and access to medicine. And so we were trying to think like, can we create these things for you and bring them into the community? So those were some of the things, but through that process, what I was really seeing, and this is really kind of my introduction into the human dimensions of wildlife conservation, is when you have conflicts going on, it is rarely the presenting conflict, like the surface layer dispute that we're seeing. That's rarely the full story, right? And so usually these conflicts that are happening have underlying conflicts that are embedded in them. And this can be things like a history of unresolved conflicts that are totally unrelated to what the current dispute is, but they're lingering and they're there. It's like they weren't resolved, so the effects of them ripple and are still there. Or, some type of past grievance. And these things, again, they can be unrelated to the present conflict, but then they get embedded into the present conflict. And as those unresolved conflicts start accumulating and intensifying just through time, then you start getting into this kind of like deep layered conflict, this deep rooted conflict. And this is where you start getting into issues like identity-based conflict, like the us versus them. And so there's like these different types of conflict. And what happens so often is that we try to address really gnarly, complex conservation challenges with processes that are meant to address something really simple and basic. And the problem with that is that most of the time what it does is it just exacerbates the conflict, right? We're not using the right process to address these really deep systemic issues. And in Congo, I think we've like got a really long history of political instability, insecurity, corruption, extreme poverty, and all of these things, that are woven into the current issues that we're seeing with bonobos. And, again, so much of these conflicts, when you're starting to get to these really messy, nuanced, conflicts, they're not even really about the animal per se that you're working with. It's really, gosh, like so much of it is social. It is about dysfunctional relationships between people. It's about eroded trust. It's about broken communication networks, people not talking with one another. And all of that messiness is what makes these challenges feel so, we call it wicked, like intractable, like, gosh, this is so messy and so complex. Like I can't get my head around it because there's just so many facets to it. And so I saw that kind of stuff happening all the time in the Congo as I really got to understand the nature of the conflicts and the ways that these different communities were interacting or not interacting with one another. And we see that same thing in the world of wolves too, right? Wolf issues are not simple. They are anything but simple. They are really complex, and they're really, I would say with wolves, 90% of what we see is social. It's not even about just like wolves killing cows or, whatnot. It's social. And the other piece that I saw, and this is probably the biggest lesson that I learned from Congo, is how critical, when you're addressing a conservation challenge, how critical a good process is for trying to get to enduring change. And this piece is so critical, and it's the most neglected. It's the piece that we give so little attention to. And process is so important. And this was so highlighted for me in Congo, because when people don't feel legitimately part of a process to get to change, you will not get genuine buy-in. And people agree to all kinds of stuff. And this can happen because folks feel like either there's a real or there's a perceived power imbalance, like who's making the decisions. And usually, like in Congo, a lot of these community members, they didn't have a lot of power within their communities, or relative to Congolese government. And or it can just be like they feel they don't have any other alternatives. They'll agree to something because what other choice do they have? But then there's no real commitment to follow through on what they agree on. And this I saw all the time in Congo. And so, people will go, not only are you not getting genuine buy-in and like commitment to a process, but people go to extraordinary measures to undermine your efforts and even sabotage your efforts. And then you don't get anywhere. And this is where that sentiment of today's win is tomorrow's loss, right? Because you may think you have figured something out and maybe you got those permits to do something. But if you don't have buy-in from the community members that are so critical to actually implementing that change, you're going to have the same conflicts come back. They're going to cycle through again, maybe in different iterations, but you're not going to get that enduring change if you don't get buy-in.
So when you left Congo, what was the result of those efforts to try and get the community to buy in? Because when you came in, you said 3 of the 13 communities were sort of bought into whatever was going on or trying to enact. What was the end result as you left right before COVID in terms of community engagement, and what were some of the things that were put in place to show them that something was working, or the process, like you said, is working or beneficial to them as well as the animal?
So I think with so much of that, it is when people start seeing things working, or like, oh, that community, but they were doing that, and now I'm seeing the benefits that they're getting. I want to be a part of that now. And so we had, there were still challenges with the 3 communities that had agreed to things, but we had members from another neighboring community that were really reluctant to even talk to us in the beginning, say, hey, I'd like to have a few more conversations and talk a little bit more about what this could look like. But, I think that one of the main things that this brings up for me is there wasn't a lot of change. I was there. So with that project, I was there for 2 years. And there wasn't a huge amount of change from the time I got there. And that, to me, really reflects that doing something and really thinking about long-term change, man, that stuff is slow, And so when we think about timing, like, well, what were all the things you accomplished? I'm like, man, sometimes I feel like I didn't really accomplish anything, But I think we have to remember that change is incredibly slow. And so 2 years is nothing. These are things like getting communities to really see benefits and have buy-in. That stuff can take like 10 years, and I think we really need to rethink how we think about time and what's progress. And, so much of the progress that I saw and what made me feel hopeful wasn't the big end goal of like, now 5 communities wanted to participate. It was individuals coming up and really expressing an interest, or not even an interest, but they really wanted to engage with me more and think about what alternatives could look like. And just having just that little shift. But it's like so much of what happens in this world in these really complex conservation challenges, they're like micro shifts and you don't even notice them right away. But then all of a sudden, collectively, they come together to really bring big change. But you're in it for the long haul.
Well, it's really interesting. Yeah, I know we're talking about, we'll transition to wolves soon, but I think there's so much interesting stuff here in your experience in the Congo, and that it does apply to kind of where we're going with the wolf thing. So I'm trying to paint a picture about kind of local involvement when you're in the Congo. So were there local entities that were, I guess, working with you in the Congo, sort of compounding on your message?
You mean people that were like helping promote the message that we were, or
local to the Congo?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
and so
definitely. And
yeah, that's what
critical.
I was going to ask. So do you think, is there a difference in when the messaging comes from a local community member versus someone from another part of the world that is not considered a generational member of the community?
Absolutely. Like it has to come from the local people,
Right.
because so much of what I saw happening in the Congo is, and remember, Congo is a very challenging place to work, not just because of the insecurity, but access to resources, getting permits to go places, just travel places is challenging. And a lot of what I saw happening in Congo is you get a lot of NGOs that come in and they have brilliant ideas and awesome things to do, but either because of resources or security, they leave in a couple years or a year. It felt like so many of the NGOs that were working there are often gone within 2 years, and that's for a myriad number of reasons, and a lot of it again could be security. But what that does is it kind of makes local communities feel like there's a sense of broken promises. Like, yeah, you're coming in here and you've got all these brilliant ideas, but then what happens? And that, so you definitely need local communities, like at least a representative of the local communities, kind of backing you. But a lot of what really got reflected to me in these projects too was we can come in with all kinds of cool and awesome ideas, but if the local communities don't have access to the resources that are needed to run those projects without any intervention from NGOs or other people, they will collapse. And I saw this so often in Congo. And just one example, we went in, so around the village where I was working, there were these huge mango trees, and they would produce all of this fruit. And so much of it was getting wasted because they simply just couldn't eat it fast enough. And there's no refrigeration, there's no way to preserve it. And I had spent a little bit of time in Uganda, and they have these really simple, brilliant setups for these solar fruit dryers, and I was like, oh, we could totally do this in Congo. And we did. We got the materials, we brought them in, we made it, everybody was excited, we did trainings, and within like a month, some of the plastic that was needed started cracking and breaking, and they didn't have access to any of it. They couldn't get it again unless it was, unless we brought it in from places. And even us as an external person that was able to go back and forth to places like Kinshasa, the big city, even we couldn't get it. And so you can have the most brilliant setup, but if folks don't have access to those resources and aren't reliant on you, they will collapse. And there are so many parallels with that when we think about like non-lethal deterrence for wolves. There's parallels there.
I've heard about those scenarios quite often where there's NGOs set up technology or infrastructure for water or something like that. And years later, these things need maintenance and the resources just aren't there for upkeep. And that's a common oversight in these kinds of efforts.
Yep.
And it seems too, because and tell me if I'm off base here, Amy, when NGOs or good-hearted people come in and they start throwing around big terms, or when we talk about ecological impacts, ecosystems, conservation, just big words and big dreams, a lot of that, as you've noted, doesn't necessarily resonate with the local population, because day to day it's just about survival. And it's about making sure, as you said, just trying to, what you mentioned before, just going to a clean place to go to the bathroom. And so all of these larger issues they're like, this is the back burner to the back burner. And I don't think anybody genuinely cares. It's just not at the forefront of their mind. So it's about addressing those issues first. And maybe thinking about the simple solutions so then you can tackle the larger stuff. Right?
Nicely.
Yeah. I mean, so when I guess we can transition this part. But yeah, this stuff is, that whole, your whole 12 years and then you being in the Congo is just absolutely fascinating about what you're able to do there. So when you come back to the States and you get involved with Wolf Haven International. What are the types of things? Because you talked about non-lethal deterrence as a parallel to, I guess, the mango tree situation to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
So what type of things are you trying to, or what did you bring, and what got you involved at Wolf Haven International, and why did you get started there specifically? And what was their thing? I know you said it was a lot about education, conservation, but why? Why them? Why in this place? I know it's in your home state. So what was the reason there?
Yeah. So, again, I had to start thinking about work that was not what I was used to. I wasn't going to be going back and doing field work. So I had to rethink, okay, what kinds of things do I want to be involved with? And then in thinking about how do I use some of this knowledge about the human dimensions of conservation that I saw and that I experienced in Congo, and how do I apply it to something here more locally? And again, that's where wolves came in, because wolves are so contentious, and there's so many avenues with the human dimensions piece of it. And so I've been connected to Wolf Haven, prior to joining their team. I grew up in this area of Washington, so of course I knew about them. And I actually, when I was working with gorillas, I was invited to come give a talk at Wolf Haven about my work there. So there were connections there. And so I knew the former executive director, Diane Gallegos. And I started, when I was looking at stuff around wolves and, all the controversies and conflicts around them, and that's when I learned about the Wolf Advisory Group and Wolf Haven's role on the Wolf Advisory Group. And Diane really seemed to be taking a different approach to wolf conservation and management than I saw as more of the mainstream approach. And she, as we started talking more about her role on the Wolf Advisory Group, and, this group is commonly called the WAG, so I'll probably refer to it as the WAG throughout. So that group operates via a philosophy and approach called conservation conflict transformation. And the group is committed to that approach for navigating wolf conservation and management. And the more I started talking about, Diane's role on the WAG and the different things that she was involved with through the WAG, I was fascinated. And, as we were going back and forth and sharing my experiences in Congo, she's like, we just immediately saw, gosh, there's so many parallels here with wolves. And we felt like it would be a really good fit to come on to Wolf Haven. And I was brought on to help kind of guide the conservation department at Wolf Haven, because it was, most of Wolf Haven's work is really allocated towards the work at the sanctuary, with the animals there. And there wasn't really a team that was currently in place for developing, building the conservation of wild wolves within the organization. So she's like, gosh, with your background in Congo and with your perspectives, and that so closely resonate with this approach of conflict transformation, she's like, could you join us? And so that's how that part came.
So when you're looking at, because you have this huge amount of knowledge, obviously, about these conflicts and these situations. So when you're coming into a situation like this with fresh eyes, because this has been, as you said, we can probably just encapsulate over the last 30 years, because we just celebrated, or just, there's 30 years of wolves being reintroduced to the Northern Rockies.
Right.
So over the last 30 years, obviously, there's been contentious, attitudes on both sides to people. And this goes to your knowledge of the Congo, and how you have people, I'm sure, on both ends of the spectrum who are trying to make these conservation or these ecological or these societal changes happen in ways that will help them so that they can do the larger task. So what knowledge is different that you're able to give the WAG than most people will have? What are the things that you are trying to bring to implement because of your strength and your knowledge in this specific area?
I think I have the on the ground experience of trying to navigate these really gnarly, complex, conservation challenges. Because it's one thing to read about it. You can read about conflict transformation. You can read all these studies about different approaches to addressing human wildlife conflict. But for me, until I actually was very deeply integrated into it, and not only like being part of it, but having to lead efforts through it, I didn't understand like the techniques really. I mean, all these things are so simple in theory, but in practice, they're so freaking hard. I mean, it's like doing the work, like it's, and this is why I struggle with the word coexistence, because we all talk about coexistence, but it's become for me a very shallow term, because it's one thing to talk about it and like these are our goals and this is our mission of what we would like to see. Man, it is really hard to put in the work that actually I think is required to get there. And that goes back to again what I started talking about with really putting priority and really emphasizing the critical piece of putting in place good processes and what that means. We can always say like, yes, it's important to have a good process, but what does that actually mean in practice? And that is hard, because so much of what goes into putting in a good process is really, it's about developing relationships with people, and not just people who have different perspectives or worldviews than you do, but often opposing perspectives and worldviews to you do, and being able to have good conversations with them and being able to ask good questions. And by good questions, I mean not coming at it like, why do you hate wolves? Or why don't you care about my livelihood? But like how to reframe those questions so that they are not making people feel defensive, but they're really like, dang, I really want to understand what you are experiencing. I really want to understand like what your reality is. And in asking questions in a way that help them feel comfortable and safe and sharing like, this is my perspective. This is how I got there, not why, but how I got there. And when we can start having those good dialogues, then we start identifying common ground. But I don't think that we're having those kinds of conversations enough. And they're uncomfortable. Like I am out of my comfort zone all the time.
Right.
Like I'm out of my wheelhouse all the time. And I feel like I'm getting stuff wrong all the time. But what I love about WAG is that it has become a space where I can get it wrong, and that's okay. I mean, we're always going to get shit wrong, right? Like that's just the nature of these really hard, messy things. But I know that I can present things and people will be like, hey, actually, that's not quite what's happening. Let me tell you why that's wrong. And so we can get in really heated discussions in the WAG. And then, during break, we're like laughing together and having a conversation about stuff. And I love that. And so much, again, bringing it back to your original question, like, what do I bring? I bring a genuine understanding of how complicated and uncomfortable and messy this all is, but a skill set, I think, to be able to productively engage with all the messiness of it. And I think the other big thing for me is when we start having good conversations with one another and we can really ask those hard, uncomfortable questions and identify common ground, so much of that brings up compromise, and an ability to compromise, and in a way of approaching compromise that isn't so negative. Like compromise is often thought of as a dirty word. When we think of compromise, we think, gosh, if we're compromising, we're a sellout. Or if we're compromising, we're sacrificing our values, or we're relinquishing control over this scenario, and I think it can be that way. I think when we don't think long term and we just give into something, yes, absolutely, compromise can be, not a good strategy. But I think it can be more strategic than that. I think if we can think long term, then we have to acknowledge that, compromise is really uncomfortable because it requires, like, I do have to do something that doesn't fully align with what I would do if it was entirely up to me, then I'm not able to do that. But if you recognize compromise as a necessary stepping stone to get to the change you want, and I'm going to keep coming back to this sentiment of enduring change, right? Something that's going to last. We have to compromise. And again, I know that feels so uncomfortable, but there's some cool research in the field, like social psychology fields, that say, people are 1,000 times more likely to agree to things that don't fully align with their values or their desired outcome if they feel supported through and part of a good process. And they feel that maybe I didn't get exactly what I wanted, but I know that my concerns and my issues were heard. They were, critically evaluated, and people feel respected in the process. 1,000 times more likely to agree to something. And so to me, that's another critical piece of the puzzle that often gets neglected. And I have such a deep understanding of what happens when we don't make compromises. All the bushmeat poaching, that I saw. I know, and so much of this it's not even just because, like, I have this immense love for humans. It's like, I know if we don't do this, the negative consequences it can have for wildlife conservation and thriving human communities, and so I've just seen that so many times unfold in different ways in the Congo, so that I see the value of it and how we have to do that within the world of wolves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you said, people, they don't feel genuinely, if they don't feel genuinely part of the process of creating change, they just won't buy in. And so getting sort of a handle on what everyone's experience is and validating that is maximally important. We certainly agree with that. And I assume when you're asking people questions about their experience, you mean producers, ranchers. Do you feel like you have some kind of grip on what is, like you said, their reality and what they are experiencing? I mean, what is the answer to those questions as far as you've been exposed to them?
I think it depends on who you ask, right? Like, everybody's scenario is a little bit different. And I think this gets back into these types of conflict where, again, some of this isn't even really about wolves themselves and that they're killing cattle sometimes. A lot of it is this really broken down sense of trust and feeling, again, like they're not part of a process. And, not superficially, but like on the surface, I think a lot of folks are feeling like, and, this year, 2024, and now, 2024, it was a particularly bad year for wolf livestock depredations in the state of Washington. There were a lot of them. And, I think it kind of comes in cycles. Some years aren't so bad. Some years are pretty bad. And this was a bad year. And I think there's a sentiment of a lot of eroded trust, broken relationships between producers and government agencies. And I think that there is a real just lack of understanding of what the true cost is of losing animals. So it's not just like, okay, the wolves killed my cow, but what about all the financial loss and time loss that goes into trying to deploy non-lethals, or what about the loss of cows that are losing weight or not reproducing at a higher rate, and so that is affecting bottom line. And those are pieces that I think get missed in the conversation a lot, like the true value of what a loss is. And I think folks are feeling pretty frustrated with that. And I think folks are feeling pretty frustrated with actions not being quick enough, to address chronic conflicts.
Yeah, and that's our understanding too, is there's a lot of these other ways that predators do influence and impact ranchers' businesses. But so how does one deliver this message? I mean, wolves have an incredible benefit on our landscape ecologically, right? To wildlife, to wild places, and to what it means to live in a wild place. But when all of that is happening, and there are all of these ways in which predators impact a rancher's life and a rancher's ability to maybe pass their business on to their kids, which is probably of maximum importance, or at least that's where they are in their heads, is how do I pass this business on to my kids if it's not a sustainable business, and if everything keeps kind of hitting us year after year, new things, right? It's not just wolves, of course. There's 20 things affecting the future of ranching and producing and meat production. So how do you have that conversation with someone that says, well, yeah, but biodiversity? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you can go into a producer and try to tell them all about, how critical wolves are. They're not going to care. I mean, maybe some do, but it's like, okay, but still my concern. And so I think the step there is we need to be having better conversations with one another. Yeah. We need to be talking with one another and figuring out, like, what is the real concern? What is your priority here? Like, what is the most important thing to you? Because when we can get into those kinds of conversations, we can start getting to common ground, and we can start thinking together how we're going to make this work. And, we're never going to convince anybody of anything, really. We may have some influence in their decisions about things or the way they think about things, but we're never going to convince anybody to now all of a sudden love wolves and appreciate their value as, a keystone species. Or for some other folks within the wolf advocacy world, like maybe we'll never convince them about the value of cows, on the landscape. But what we can do is find the areas where we do connect, because that's where the magic happens, right? That's where you can start really having conversations with people and figuring things out. And, there's this sentiment that, I don't know if you know who Monica Guzman is, but she's a writer, journalist. She works a lot with human conflict, but through political divisions. But so much of what she talks about resonates within the world of wolves. And, she had made a comment that it just really resonates with me. It's like, whoever is underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your mind, in your imagination. And that, to me, it gets to this idea of, like, we make assumptions all the time about people, and assumptions are so incredibly dangerous because they're usually wrong, right? Or at least a component of them is wrong. But they very quickly lead us down this path of feeling like, well, gosh, if this person just had better information, if they just understood the value of biodiversity or the value of wolves as a keystone species, or if they just had better science, or this person, gosh, they don't care about wolves, or this person doesn't care about my livelihood. Yep. And then, or it's like, gosh, this person has all this information, they must be stupid, or worse, like, gosh, this person is a monster, and how are we ever going to get to a sense of genuine, like, coexistence, collaboration, when we come at the conflict with that head and heart space? Like, we won't.
This is a very important point too that you bring up, Amy, is that it seems that anyone in any of these issues, wolves aside, I think any wildlife, human conflict issue or human issue what's a way that you've seen, because Stephen asked that question, like, how do you have that conversation? Is there a key to basically unlock these preconceived notions? And like these preconceived notions, and sometimes, I mean, as you said, 2 years is such a, minuscule amount of time in the long term, if we're talking about a 10-year project or 15-year project. Is this one of those things that sometimes those take years to sort of break down those barriers of our initial concerns, our initial anger, our initial angst, whatever it may be on whatever side of the conversation you're on? Is there a way in these human dimensions to break that down? I know it's kind of a convoluted question, but those seems to be where people start. They start at combativeness as opposed to starting at compromise. So what's like, when you see it in Congo and you see it here, what are ways that you can try to sort of chip away at that?
Yep. I think the key is curiosity, and this is kind of a buzzword these days, but it's so true. It's like, we have to lean into curiosity to really understand how people are perceiving this. Like wolf issues are so messy and complex, and they're perceived in so many different ways. The only way we're going to start breaking down these barriers is if we get curious enough to ask those hard questions and to break out of our silos and to have questions with folks that we wouldn't normally have conversations with, and to really start there, I think, is the first key. And to really know that this stuff takes time. This is not going to be, there is a mantra in the conservation, conflict, transformation world: go slow to go fast, right? Like you really have to reevaluate your sense of time. But I also think that we are so fixated in a world that is like wants outcomes, and at the expense of putting in the time to get a good process and to build relationships. And for me, relationships are an outcome, right? They're probably the most critical outcome that you can get. And we're not putting enough attention on the relationship piece of it. And I think the other big piece of that, like, how do we start chipping away at this? And this is another piece that came out of Monica Guzman's work that I really like, because we get stuck in this mindset of like, gosh, I can't work with that person, or I don't want to work with that person, or I'm never going to make, or like traction with that person because we just have different values. I value wildlife. They value cows. How am I going to ever? But it's like, actually, we all have the same values, right? We all care about freedom and fairness, justice, all that, but we prioritize them differently based on the issue. And so, it's like, but what happens so often is that we mistake this different prioritization of values as an absence of the ones we care most about. And so that's how we get to that space of thinking like, gosh, this person doesn't care at all about this thing that I hold so close in my heart. They must be a monster if they don't care about this. And it's not that they don't care. It's that they care about something else more. And so we need to have those conversations. What is it that you care about more? And tell me about that. And I think that process, that piece of it, is the way we really start chipping away and figuring out, like, and the thing is that what I saw a lot in Congo was that people came eventually to rally behind me and support me, not because they had a newfound love of gorillas, or bonobos. They came to help me because they actually really cared about me. And they're like, I don't really care about this, but I know it means a lot to you, and I really value you. And so I'm going to help you. And I see that unfolding all the time with, stuff in the wolf advocacy or, in the wolf advisory group. And it's like, no, maybe there's producers that are never going to have a huge love for wolves, but maybe they really commit to doing everything they can with these non-lethals. And it's not just because of that they care, they don't want to move to lethal removal of wolves, but they really know that we're trying to work together. This is something that can support me, and they come to help you as a person. And I think we miss how important that is.
Yeah, and we miss that the stakes are not the same for everybody. I mean,
exactly.
like you said, everybody cares about the same 5 things. It's just whether the conversation you're having threatens those things in your life or not. And I think the thing that people are rejecting, both sides of this topic have behaved both really productively and really unproductively at different times, depending on the conversation and who's having it. So this is not calling anybody out, but there's certainly a rejection of this idea that that people in another part of the state are not, there's not the same at stake as there is for the other part of the state. And I think that's a major distinction between people who live in rural areas versus those who live in urban areas that should be really easy for us all to get on the same page about, is the stakes are certainly not the same. It's easy for people to say biodiversity, and I'm one of those people, even though I happen to live in a rural area in the mountains. I don't live near a city, but I still, because I don't raise cattle, I have the luxury of my priority being biodiversity, wild lands, having keystone species on the landscape, all of these things. But everyone, I think, can empathize with how difficult it would be to have to decide between the health of the environment and science and your livelihood, and whether you can pass a business you've been working on for 20 years or 3 generations down to the next generation. It's just not an easy place to be. You said and we're all in agreement that it's important to find those places, like the fact that most people care about their families, their friends, their kids, and their livelihood. That's like the main things people care about. They care about their health and their family's health and all those things. So other than those things, where do both groups connect? I mean, where is the common ground as far as you can tell from these conversations with the advisor group? Or are those core things really the things? Or are there topics or elements that maybe we're not onto?
No, I think one big one too is that working landscapes are really valuable for conservation, right? I mean, nobody wants to see land being subdivided and developed into parking lots to Walmart, right? And working landscapes provide, the ground for that, and they provide corridors for wildlife. But even that, I feel like gets missing in the dialogue sometimes, And I often hear like, cows are not non-native. They need to get off public lands. They destroy the landscape. And yes, they can. But I also am connected with a lot of producers who are doing some pretty amazing work for conservation initiatives. And so where I am in Olympia, in Thurston County and surrounding, there's some really cool programs around conservation grazing and putting in really intense rotational systems, and they're building habitat for Oregon spotted frog, for Taylor's checker spot butterflies, for Mazama pocket gophers. And, I think we need to really acknowledge the value that working lands have and celebrate that. And instead of having conversations about how cows suck and, need to, because that's not going to resonate with folks. But
how do you get, because that's such a beautiful sentiment that those habitats are being built. How do we get more of that out to people to understand like regenerative farming and cycle how are those this is also the fault of sensationalism and what's going to get the most clicks. And Steve and I have kind of talked about that a little bit, we're not getting political here by any means, but it just, we don't see those things. We never see the positives. So how does WAG, or how do you get those stories and those particular personal things out to the rest of the public on either side, on all four corners, in every direction, so they see there's compromise and there's stuff that can be done on all angles?
Yeah. Well, first is get invited to be on the Wolf Connection podcast, right? There's the story there, right? Wolf Haven we have a pretty broad reach of folks because there's a lot of people who, really love wolves that are connected to us. And we put out a quarterly magazine with different articles. I often write some of the feature pieces. And so one of the things I want to do is write a feature piece on the value of working landscapes. And this will go out to a huge community of folks, not just in Washington, but around the world. So on Wolf Haven's property, we have 36 acres of Mima Mound prairie that we manage, and, connecting with some of the local producers in the area and, doing events where we celebrate that work and invite people out. And, part of what the program that I'm trying to build now and that Jeff is trying to build with me is this program called Wolfwise Communities. And it's really about working with communities in our region, in Thurston, Mason, Lewis County, around Olympia, and where Wolf Haven is, where there are not yet wolves, but to connect with communities and start talking about different ways we can help promote each other's work, and really starting to identify ways that we can help each other, and also identify where are the areas here that might end up presenting some novel challenges when wolves come. But through all of that work, then we really start collaborating more on sharing some of these pieces, like the value of working lands.
It's great what you're working on. It's worth promoting the idea of collaborating on this, of valuing each other's differences and really each other's priorities, like you said, and recognizing that we just do need each other for any of this to work. It's just a fact, and really compromising, because at the extremes there are no solutions. Like getting rid of cows is not a compromise. A lot of people believe that, a nose to tail meat diet is the healthiest human diet available. And I don't know that anybody wants to get in the business of regulating what people can eat. So I don't know that that's the answer for everybody. And getting rid of predators is also not a compromise. I mean, we've identified the importance of predators. We've identified the void of diversity, the issues with soil and vegetation, and the necessity of predator-prey dynamics to I guess, work towards repairing some of that. So there's no good solution at the extremes. So where is it? What is the compromise that you've maybe identified from your experience with the advisory group? I mean, what is the compromise that seems like it has legs, like it might work? Or is this thing, compromise, still elusive?
Even in places like northeastern Washington, where there's a lot of conflict and folks who are experiencing that conflict maybe sometimes want quicker reaction, maybe to going towards lethal removal of wolves. That's a really hard topic, right? And one of the things that we are talking about is like, okay, if like Washington State has very minimal lethal removal actions, right? Like they happen, sometimes they're needed, but relative to other places, like our numbers are pretty low. And that's despite an increasing wolf population in the state. But, are there other things? Are there ways to kind of step up our non-lethal tools? Are there other things that we can do, or maybe a little bit more aggressive, that everybody can get behind? And one of the things we're exploring now is like, what are some things, like, could we do non-injurious, non-lethal harassment? Like, can we set up a scenario when there is chronic conflict happening with wolves? We set up a scenario that is so unpleasant for wolves, so scary, which I know that doesn't sound nice, but you're not killing them, right? Like, is there anything we can do there? And that's an avenue that I think everybody can get behind. Like, it might not be nice to think about really harassing a wolf, but if it's non-injurious and it prevents them from maybe having to go to lethal removal, heck yeah, why aren't we like pursuing that? And so I think that's an avenue that, I have brought up with some folks on the WAG, and maybe the next big like focus conversation, something that I'm really interested in pursuing. And I don't know what shape that will take or what that will look like, but I think to me, it just feels like a no-brainer. It's like, if we can do this, why not? I think, and I don't think I'm sure there are some out there, but most producers, they're not asking for wolves to be eradicated or removed. They're just, and they're not even saying we don't want wolves on the landscape. They're saying when there's a problem with wolves and it's, it's attacking my cattle and I'm using non-lethals and I'm throwing everything I got at them, sometimes there are scenarios where we just need an immediate reaction. We need to just take that wolf out. And that's a different sentiment than folks just like, I don't want wolves on the landscape, because that's not what's happening here.
I wonder too, if there's something within the WAG or even in anyone who's listening to this, if there is that relationship, and there's a unique relationship within the WAG because you represent all of these different, stakeholders in this, that you can have people who are, I'm trying not to pick sides here, but it's, if you're in the ranching coalition or the livestock coalition, maybe go to a sanctuary like a Wolf Haven and see the process of what it's like to intake a wolf or a wolf dog, and see what is able to happen with those animals at a facility like that takes care of them, that nurtures them and gives them a healthy life. And vice versa, those who maybe on the wolf side go into a ranching community or a livestock producer, see how they work the land, whatever it is. And it goes back to and this to me isn't really a compromise. This is more, as you were stating before, an understanding of where different folks are coming from. I mean, we see this, I see this a lot when people come to the sanctuary and they understand the care and the mission and the value of all of our wolf dogs that we rescue, and the lessons that they're able to teach and the healing they're able to provide just by being in a safe space and having that time to settle and know that they're safe. And so any way that we could go back and forth in that way, that would be something I would love to see even more of, is just this cross-pollination of people, because then you have both sides, and then you would be almost unstoppable because you have seen both sides and you're able to have a little bit more of an informed choice in that way. I'm probably thinking pie in the sky, but to me, that seems like
that's happening. I mean, within the WAG, we often, when we have our quarterly meetings, we sometimes have field trips for folks. So just last April, the meeting was in Olympia and all the WAG members came out to Wolf Haven. And then prior to that, all the WAG members were down in Southeast Washington and visited one of the ranchers' operations, and went and talked with her whole community and family. So that is happening. It's probably just not happening on a big enough scale, but that is also very much the vision for this WolfWise program that we're developing. And so we just recently had the Southwest Washington Grazing Association come out to Wolf Haven and go through our sanctuary and visit the prairie and see all the wolves. We are connecting with members of like the Thurston County Agricultural Committee and sharing this vision. So it is happening. And that is precisely what we are hoping to build more of through this WolfWise program as well.
That's tremendous. I mean, yeah, Amy, you've taken us on a worldwide journey, to be honest.
Hopefully it's at least coherent. There are so many different ways this could go. But
no, it's we're incredibly fortunate to be able to talk to somebody like you who has had this worldly experience and are be able to bring it somewhere to a domestic spot that people are able to hear and visually be able to see. And it's so important and valuable to have these conversations, like you say, and to find these compromises so that we can move forward in the larger picture, which is to make sure that we have the world that we want to live in. And I think the majority of us believe in that. For anybody who's listening, what's the best place to keep up to date on Wolf Haven and also with the WAG and what's going on? Because you talked about newsletters and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can visit Wolf Haven's website and sign up for our newsletter. And with the WAG, if you go to the Wolf Advisory Group website, they have a whole calendar and it has where all the meetings are going to be taking place. And then a couple days before each meeting, it has a posted agenda. And then about anywhere from a week or so, or a couple of weeks after the meeting happens, they post a summary note. So those meetings are also for anybody that's in Washington. They're open to the public, and you can also stream them live no matter where you are. And those meetings are not recorded, but you can definitely stream live. And on their website, there will be a Zoom link that you can tap into when the meetings are going to be had.
That's tremendous. And we're going to have all the links. Anybody who's listening, they'll be in the description. So I think most people have that by now, but I always like to double check that people are aware to go to the description and find that. Last thing for you, Amy, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Humility. And, there's a great sentiment by the author George Saunders, and I try to share it as broadly as I can whenever I can. And it so perfectly captures the essence of humility around all the issues with wolves. And it's along the lines of nothing in this world, not a single thing, hurts us more and hurts others more than our certainties. And in a world full of people who seem to know everything and who passionately think they know everything based on very little and slanted information, where we mistake certainty for power, how refreshing it is to be in the company of people who are courageous enough to remain uncertain. Love it.
I love that. That's right. And that's what we try to do, is be humble here and learn as much as humanly possible. Amy Porter, thank you so much for this incredible conversation and your world travels and all the work you're doing in Washington State. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate it.
Absolutely. Just hang tight while we sign off. I'll see you all out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.